Welcome to this GRESB 2022 EMEA Regional Insights event for infrastructure, co-hosted by GRESB and us at Position Green. Maybe just a word from our side is that we know many of you from our work as Cathy. We have in September joined Position Green that specializes in ESG advisory, ESG software, e-learning and insurance. We will continue our specialization in infra here with Position Green, now with broader coverage. So the way we see it is that infrastructure investing has never been more important than it is now. So the investment practices of infrastructure investors is an essential part of addressing the climate challenges ahead of us. And we have a very strong belief that mitigation and adaptation efforts from infrastructure investors will be reflected not only in the ESG performance of assets, but also in the financial performance and value of assets. We believe that GRESB plays a very important role as a platform for ESG data and benchmarks for real assets to support infrastructure investors in these efforts. And we are extremely pleased to be a GRESB partner and here to co-host this event together with GRESB. Maybe I should say that my name is Anders Klinkby, I'm Managing Director here, and I'm very glad to present the program here, where we in a minute will hear from David Thomas, who will be talking about the results for 2022. We will be hearing from a panel afterwards, moderated by Cathy Granneman, Manager of Member Relations with GRESB. We're pleased to present Catherine Sherwin, Director for Real Assets at BlackRock, Christoph Reinhardt, Head of Risk Management at Munich Re, and Peter Plantner, my colleague here from Position Green Advisory. And with that, I'd like to hand it to David Thomas to take us through the results. Thanks a lot, David.
Many thanks, Anders, and welcome everyone. Thank you again for joining us live here today. I'm David Thomas. I'm based here in London, and I head up business development for our infrastructure platform in EMEA. And over the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to take you through an in-depth and I hope insightful look at the 2022 assessment of results for the EMEA Infrastructure benchmark. I'm going to be picking out some of the key analysis points that the team here at GRESB have been busy working through since the results released back at the beginning of October. So let's kick things off and take a look at the size of the infrastructure benchmark and the participation growth across both the fund and the asset level. And we're going to start with a global view. So as can be seen here, this year's asset benchmark represents 1.1 trillion euro of gross asset value. And we continue to see very encouraging growth with 652 assets reporting, and that's up from the 558 that reported to GRESB in 2021. Shifting our focus to the asset assessment in EMEA, regional participation has grown by 12% in 2022 to a total of 342 assets. That now represents 548 billion euro in gross asset value. As a region, EMEA continues to have the highest representation in the 2022 benchmark, now covering 52% of all the assets participating in GRESB. The largest increase in terms of growth in the region for infrastructure assets comes from the Eastern European countries, with a 33% increase compared to 2021. This is a very welcome outcome and a clear signal that we're now seeing advancements in overall ESG practices across the wider region, not just in those countries that still represent the majority of the benchmark in Northern Europe and in the UK. So turning to global fund benchmark, we see gross asset value rising to 653 billion, with 166 funds reporting. Again, more encouraging signs for the development of the benchmark, where we have an increase from the 149 funds that reported to GRESB in 2022. The EMEA regional benchmark size remains stable, with a similar number of funds, that's 62 compared to the 63 funds last year, now representing a total of 93 billion euro in gross asset value. Now, the consistency of this regional result is within our expectations, especially when we consider that a significant percentage of the infrastructure funds, approximately a third, so 55, report under the globally diversified classification. And this therefore has a significant impact on the individual regional allocations. So now let's go a little bit further into the EMEA benchmark and take a look at the country level and sector participation. So firstly, we see that EMEA has the highest country representation across all of the global regions, with 24 countries covered in the 2022 benchmark, incorporating all corners of the region, and primarily Northern Europe and the most represented sub-region, with a total of 165 entities. Northern European participation continues to be dominated by the UK, which with more than 100 assets has the strongest presence in the region. And that's followed by Spain with 41 assets, France with 30 assets, and then the home of GRESB, the Netherlands with 21 assets. Now, whilst the chart here details only those top 5 countries, it's also important to note a few other high performers. So Italy, Switzerland, and the Scandinavian countries of Finland and Denmark have all continued to experience significant growth. And on a further positive note, we also witnessed assets in countries new to GRESB benchmark starting to report. So with Greece and Iceland now both included within that group. The development in the number of countries present in the benchmark is a particularly telling and encouraging sign, illustrating that the progress is being made towards sustainability practices across the region, with a telling nod perhaps to the influence of the January 2023 enforcement of the SFDR regulations. So moving on to the sector level participation, we can see that the majority of assets in EMEA come from the transportation sector with 96 assets. And that's followed by renewable power with 78 assets and social infrastructure with 64 assets. And here we see EMEA very much in line with the overall benchmark sector composition. When looking at the fund level instead, the majority of funds in Europe, that's 34, have a diversified composition in terms of sector allocation. So now let's turn to the scoring insights and regional comparisons. Firstly, when looking at the GRESB model for assets, if we put the 3 globally diversified assets to one side, the EMEA region sits as the best performer in 2022 with an average GRESB score of 80, and that's superior to the increased global benchmark of 79. At the aggregate level, EMEA assets have scored 10 points higher in 2022. Within this context, it's interesting to consider the impact of the relative stability of the infrastructure assessments over the past few years from a content perspective. Now, in comparison, the 2023 assessments will include new indicators requiring members to have fresh considerations with a particular focus on net zero. If you'd like further detail and insight into those changes for 2023, please do get in touch for details on the standards changes webinars that we're going to be running on the 29th and the 30th of November. And I'll show a reminder of how you can sign up for those sessions at the end of the presentation. So back to the asset scoring, regionally, the key contributor to the asset score increases is Northern Europe, with UK assets representing some of the highest scores, alongside those in France. And I think this further exemplifies this part of the region's advanced sophistication in the reporting process. Now, finally, there's more impressive news from Eastern Europe, where despite the high presence of first-year participants, we see the average score increasing roughly by 4.5 percentage points. At the fund level, the positive trends continue, with the EMEA average GRESB score increasing by 5 points to 83, continuing to track slightly above the benchmark average of 81. Now, I just wanted to shine a light here on the first-year participation scores, because we've seen some really impressive developments. So first-time participation in Europe, first-time participants in Europe have outperformed their global counterparts by roughly 2 percentage points in 2022. Yet, as can be expected, they maintain a significant gap when compared to those longer-term participants. For instance, those who have been reporting to GRESB since 2018. Now, this trend is very much expected as GRESB is a journey for improvement, and we see this coming through clearly as reporting entities build on those scores year after year. That being said, it's very encouraging to see that the ESG starting point and performance of new participants in 2022 is significantly higher than in previous years. For instance, in 2020, first-year participants had an average GRESB score of 52, and as a comparison, in 2022, this has risen to an average of 66. This clearly exemplifies that the ESG gap between newcomers and leaders has been reducing faster over time, a clear sign in the growing sophistication and awareness of the industry when it comes to ESG considerations. And we see a similar situation occurring at the fund level, with new funds achieving an average GRESB score of 70 during their very first year of reporting. Now, within the context of the scoring analysis, it's also important for us to consider how data coverage is developing in the benchmark. Average increases in 2022 assessments were driven by a scoring uplift across both the management and the performance components, and we can highlight risk management as the main contributor to the fund score improvements. As mentioned, this positions EMEA as a top performer also for funds after diversified funds. Yet one of the main drivers of the GRESB fund scores remains a performance component, which is weighting 70% of the fund score, calculated as the ESG performance of the fund's portfolio. Now, in terms of portfolio coverage, the average infrastructure fund portfolio coverage by equity share in 2022 is 67% in EMEA, compared to the global benchmark average of 62%. Regionally, EMEA has the second highest portfolio coverage behind Oceania. Now, at the asset level, which is shown on the chart here, the EMEA region has improved across the board. And as we can see, looking at the data coverage for elements of high materiality, such as energy, greenhouse gas emissions, and health and safety, we continue to see significant advancements. The data shows that the vast majority of the EMEA participants are now able to report the required information with a 94% level of coverage on average. And crucially, this data coverage analysis also helps us to highlight and then understand the areas where there is significant room for improvement. And it's important to stay in touch with this as we seek to drive improvement across the industry, across all aspects. So to pick on a few areas specifically, air pollution and biodiversity both currently have a data coverage level in the mid to high 80s, while certifications and awards remain the indicator, and by quite some margin, with the lowest data coverage around 26%. However, progress is the important point here, and we're seeing gradual improvement on these metrics. For instance, biodiversity saw an average score of 79 percentage points in 2022, and that's up compared to the 57 in 2021. Perhaps this particular improvement can be attributed to the progress and awareness of TNFD and the emergence of more sophisticated guidance as a result of the process. Now, finally, when it comes to collecting and reporting on qualitative information, such as policies on ESG issues, we see that the EMEA region is improving too, with a 13% score increase in 2022. Excuse me. Now, in addition to showing us how the EMEA region is performing, we can also utilize underlying GRESB data to a further extent, supporting funds and assets continuing regulatory reporting requirements. For instance, analysis from this year's assessment offers us a key insight when we consider the fast approaching next stage of SFDR regulatory reporting requirements. Crucially, this exemplifies that infrastructure participants that report to GRESB are well positioned to report to the principal adverse impact mandatory indicators too. To illustrate this more clearly, let's consider a scenario where GRESB is itself a financial market participant, and the GRESB asset assessment universe represents our portfolio. Our own SFDR disclosure coverage would be illustrated like this, as shown on your screens now. What this helps us to understand is that those participants who are already accustomed to collecting and reporting asset level data to GRESB are now very well positioned in terms of being able to disclose ESG data in accordance with the SFDR PAIs. To support this, GRESB has just released its SFDR reporting solution for infrastructure funds and assets, and will provide a platform for members to prepare for those mandatory disclosures in 2023. Now, let's take a look at how we can also inform TCFD alignment. The assessment results clearly show that the year-on-year level of TCFD alignment is going up across the board for all four TCFD core elements from 2021 to 2022 for both funds and assets. We're seeing increases ranging from 5 to 10%. And notably, the risk management element has shown the biggest increase across all elements in both assessments, suggesting perhaps that in most cases, this was the next phase of TCFD alignment for those entities that have already achieved alignment on strategy elements. For assets, coverage is higher when it comes to transition risk identification. So 62% of participants that have answered this indicator have in place a systematic approach for identifying transition risks that could have a material financial impact on the entity. And this is compared to the 54% that have a systematic approach, which also assesses the material financial impact of transition risks on the business and/or financial plannings of the entity. Now, among the elements covered by the risk identification process, we see significant coverage across the elements, with coverage of market risks at 92%, followed by policy and legal risks at 91%, technology risks at 89%, and finally, reputational risks at 85%. Now, turning quickly to the fund level, coverage appears to be much higher than for assets, where we see 84% of entities reporting a systematic process for identifying transition risks that could have a material financial impact on the entity. Moreover, on average, coverage of the various elements covered by the risk identification process also appear to be higher than at the asset level. So market risks leading here with 100%, followed by policy and legal risks, 94%, technology risks at 92%, and reputational risks at 80%. And just a reminder here that to help our members identify TCFD gaps and support alignment to disclosure expectations, GRESB developed a TCFD Alignment Report for both the fund and the asset level. Now, we're just going to have a quick change of direction here and take a look at the GHG target setting that has evolved in the past few years. So the chart here exemplifies 2 points. Firstly, across the past 4 years of assessment cycles, there's been a clear increase in the number of entities in proportion to the benchmark that are setting GHG targets. Secondly, net zero target commitments have remained stable with a 2% increase between 2019 and 2022. And this is in the context of a growing benchmark. This is mainly due to first-year participants' low to moderate coverage on these metrics. However, what we can see here is that for the first time, almost half of the benchmark have targets in place. So in summary, there's evidence of really encouraging progress towards target setting. And here at GRESB, we will of course continue to track these trends, and you can expect more detailed content to follow in standalone publications and dedicated sections of our website. Now, finally, to round off, I just wanted to pull out to a broader view and take a look at a comparison across developed and developing economies. We've uncovered some really interesting trends here this year. From a global perspective, participation from assets located in developing countries has increased by 20 assets in 2022, up now to 72 from the 52 assets who reported in 2021. Sector-wise, the most represented are transportation and renewable power assets, and this is also in line with the overall GRESB benchmark composition. Now, the key takeaway here is that contrary to general belief, that would see developing countries underperforming against developed countries, developing economies are performing better on average than developed ones in both 2021 and 2022, with the difference in average GRESB scores being gapped by 7 percentage points in 2022 compared to 2021. And infrastructure assets in developing economies represent a growing yet small portion of the 2022 infrastructure benchmark at 13%, and crucially with an average GRESB score that remains in line with the global GRESB average. So what can we take away from this? Well, this trend in growth and scores helps to exemplify that the GRESB asset assessment is both suitable and increasing in popularity in developing economies globally. And bringing this back to an EMEA specific perspective, this serves as a positive foundation as we look forward to significantly developing the benchmark across the African continent, and also our efforts to greatly increase both growth and engagement in that region in 2023 and beyond. Well, that's just about everything from me on this year's regional results. Looking forward to 2023, a final reminder to join us on November the 29th or the 30th for our GRESB Foundation Updates and Standard Changes webinar, and you can register for that on the events page at gresb.com. And as always, if you'd like further details on GRESB Infrastructure Fund or asset assessments, the new SFDR reporting platform, or indeed the TCFD Alignment Report that I mentioned, please do get in touch. And with that, many thanks for joining. I'll now hand back to my colleague, Cathy Granneman, Manager at our Infrastructure Member Relations team for today's panel discussion. Cathy, over to you.
Thanks, David. And thank you all for joining. As mentioned, please use the chat function to ask any questions. We'll have a little time at the end to answer any questions you might have, either about David's presentation or about the panel session that we are about to begin. So as David said, my name is Cathy Granneman. I'm a manager in the member relations team here at GRESB, based in Amsterdam, and I'm particularly responsible for our infrastructure members in the EMEA region. And today we have a fantastic panel, if I may say so. We have 3 speakers, each of them bringing their own unique perspective on the topic of climate risk and resilience. First off, we have Christoph Reinhardt from Munich Re. So Christoph is head of risk management partners at Munich Re, one of the world's leading providers of reinsurance, primary insurance, and risk solutions. He leads a team that focuses on developing agile and tailor-made risk management solutions for assessing physical risks from climate change. He is based in Munich, which comes as no surprise, and has more than 20 years experience in the reinsurance industry. Has developed traditional and non-traditional risk management and risk transfer solutions in close cooperation with the private and public sector. And I should mention that you can access the Munich Re climate risk data set via the GRESB portal. So if you're interested in that, pay close attention to the panel. So thank you, Christoph, for joining. And then secondly, I'll continue the round of introductions and then I'll ask you your first questions. Secondly, we have Peter Plassener at Position Green. And Peter is a director in Position Green, where he advises asset managers and owners on the different ESG and sustainability frameworks out there, amongst others, of course, GRESB, but also SFDR, EU taxonomy. And Position Green completes EU taxonomy assessments for investors and companies. And Peter has assessed different approaches to physical climate risk for these companies and assets. And of course, Position Green is a long-standing partner with GRESB and works together with many of our GRESB participant members. And Peter has also first-hand experience with using Munich Re climate risk data in the GRESB portal. So perhaps we have a little time at the end to talk about that as well. And then last but certainly not least is Cathy Granneman, Global Head of Infrastructure and Real Estate Sustainable Investing at BlackRock. She's also a senior member of the BlackRock Alternative Sustainable Investing team, which is responsible for instilling BlackRock's firm-wide sustainable investing strategy across the infrastructure, real estate, private equity, private credits, and hedge funds businesses. She works with BlackRock's infrastructure and real estate investment teams to integrate sustainability and climate considerations, including, of course, physical climate risk and resilience within the investment processes, asset management activities, and product strategy. Together, BlackRock's infrastructure and real estate platforms manage over 80 billion in equity and debt investments and investor commitments. And besides all of that, she is also the chair of the Infrastructure Standards Committee at GRESB and a long-term supporter of both GRESB real estate and infrastructure. So I think we're going to have a fantastic session, and I'm really glad all three panelists are able to join today. Thank you so much, especially seeing that we've just concluded COP27. Climate risk and resilience is really much top of mind these days. I think we could probably spend the entire session talking about it, but we'll try to sort of keep it a little bit contained. So the first thing I would like to ask the panel is, how do you approach climate risk in your daily practices, especially at the asset level? We see a lot of different assets in infrastructure, and the approach on climate risk can differ so much from asset to asset. And I'd really like to hear your perspectives on this. And to sort of start really at the most granular level, the data approach, we'll start with Christoph. So Christoph, would you like to start with responding to that question?
Yeah, thank you very much, and a warm welcome here to the audience. Well, I think we have basically three important steps, and how we are doing our risk assessment, but as well as our customers are doing this with our scores. So first of all, and it's not new, you have to identify the risk about the hazard exposure and how the risk might change over time. The second one, I guess that's getting every day more important, is really to measure it. Also getting a financial impact behind, in order then to decide upon how you wanted to manage it. And the management, we see it quite interesting wise now in the EU taxonomy, really how you can mitigate also. What are the public mitigation measurements in place? Do you know about them? How the individual asset is protected? And then even further on, if you cannot mitigate or you can only reduce the impact, the important question is how you can reduce the financial impact as of today or over time. And I think that's the three basic components where customers are using, for example, our services, or how we are addressing the risk and climate action plan, and afterwards to the asset we are reinsuring or where we are investing in.
Great. And Peter, of course, so, we have this data, we have the understanding of the impact. Now, how do you sort of translate it? How do you, as a consultant, help your clients with sort of understanding that?
Yeah, so great to be here. Also, it's a very interesting topic that we see a lot of developments in, right? So it's great to be discussing it here, I think. I think Christoph said it very well in terms of how the logic works, so to speak. Identify the risks, understand what's going to change, and then draw a conclusion from that in terms of what should you then do, i.e. choose your adaptation measures. And So in that sense, I think we are aligned on that, and that's also the way the taxonomy seems to work. So I think that the most important thing is that the taxonomy, and that's our work centers around the taxonomy, and the key component there is the materiality part of that, right? So what's a material risk in this sense? And that's something, as with many other things, the taxonomy don't define. What is considered material? That's up for interpretation. And to gauge the materiality, we sort of need a financial measure, or that would be at least an ideal situation where we would be able to, and we have seen in our work, we see some of that out there. Then in terms of the quality of it and the precision, that's of course something that can be debated. But that mostly stems from the large uncertainty there still exists in how to forecast the climate 50 years in the future or 100 years in the future. So I think in our work, we're still seeing some doubts from assets on why this is really necessary to spend a lot of time on. And what we try to say is that you don't necessarily need to spend a lot of time, because if you don't have any underlying risks, so to speak, it doesn't take long to identify that. But if you have underlying risks, of course, the assessment gets more complex. But then that makes sense, I think. And then one key point as investors, I think it's even though the companies can think that, okay, we're talking about something that's 50 years in the future, we will have time to, whatever will happen, we will have time to fix it. We don't have to think about that today. But as investors, if you invest today, it's great to know if there lies a large investment in terms of adaptation measures that is not identified yet, but will be hopefully can be identified. So in that sense, I think for investors, it's really important to think about this more than maybe for in the logic of companies.
Yeah, and that's a very nice segue over to an actual investor, Catherine. I'm sure you must get some pushback from some of these assets as well, saying like, hey, as Peter said, maybe some of this stuff is quite far into the future, but then it's of course your responsibility as a money manager effectively to make sure that happens. So how do you see that in your daily practice? Do you recognize this?
Yeah, it's a great question, Casey, and thanks again for having me on the panel today. I'll scale it back, and it's something that our CEO, Larry Fink, has been incredibly vocal of, in that climate risk is investment risk. And we truly believe that ESG integrated, including climate integrated portfolios, can provide better risk-adjusted returns for our clients. And I think that is really important as infrastructure investors, and leaning into what Peter was saying about us being long-term liquid investors. We're investing our clients' capital now, and typically we might be investing in infrastructure projects or infrastructure portfolio companies over a 10 to 15-year time horizon. So actually understanding what those long-term implications of a changing physical climate are potentially going to be, and that could be changing wind speeds on a wind farm to actual flood risk, sea level rise, wildfire risk, hurricane activity across a 500-kilometer natural gas pipeline. So it is so important for us to be thinking about those potential scenarios and how they could play out in a really material way across our portfolio. It's probably easiest to bucket how we think about climate risk in two areas, because there's the investment side and then there's the ongoing asset management, and how do we continue to think about climate future-proofing across those assets that we already have within our portfolios. So we've integrated climate risk in a very defined way within our investment process, and it's really been an additional component of our broader ESG integration approaches. We're utilizing very similar technology to what Munich have developed, but essentially a company called Rhodium Group and their climate science data into our Aladdin climate database. So Aladdin is kind of the central software system that we use here for risk analysis at BlackRock. not going into climate science in too much details, but we're running the geolocation of all potential investment opportunities through that system against RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5 scenarios. So there's representation concentration pathways that indicate against a warming climate, what are the potential changes as it relates to things like hurricane frequency and activity, sea level rise, inland flooding, wildfire risk, precipitation change, temperature change, etc. Now, why is that important? A, we want to understand at the actual geolocation of those potential investments, what is a change in climate and how does that impact our underwriting? Because we might be able to incorporate resilience into smart CapEx and smart asset management, but there might be some risks that we believe just cannot be underwritten. And again, going back to being that long-term investor. And then all of that information is also feeding into our active asset management. We are asset managers. This is real in the context of infrastructure. We take on these investments and we play a really active role in managing those portfolio companies, but also working with asset operators on the ground and actually managing these physical assets. And I think there's a couple of examples which I'll lean into. Is one actually is a project that we have down in Houston, in Texas, and we'd undertaken some preliminary studies around climate risk a few years ago, and actually we'd done things like move the M&E to the rooftop of that asset and elevated the basement by 4 feet to kind of reduce the risk of flooding and things like that, because it's Texas, it's hurricane territory. And so when Hurricane Harvey came in 2017, actually that as an asset was relatively resilient against the flooding that they had in that town. And just for context, there was 60 inches of rain fell in that period of Hurricane Harvey landfall. So significant amount of water. And actually that kind of the pre-work that we'd done on that asset made it more resilient. There's another example actually in Chile, where we are building out an airport at the moment, and we're looking at the changes around precipitation that can be anticipated, including rainfall and snowfall in that region. And it's actually changing the rooftop design, because we're actually changing kind of the sloping of the rooftop to accommodate what we believe will be changing precipitation environment in there. So this stuff is really real. It's influencing both investment decision making, but importantly, it's feeding through to the active asset management, allocation of capital expenditure, how we're underwriting these investments to integrate what we believe will be kind of climate resilience and risk considerations in the long run.
Wow, that's incredibly interesting, especially the example of actually changing your rooftop design based on precipitation modeling. That's fantastic. And I have to say, I'm a graduate in the climate science department, and it kind of nerds me out to hear that. That's very interesting to hear. I also want to kind of keep it open to the group. So Christoph and Peter, feel free to jump in if you want to respond to what Captain just described, because I think there's quite a lot to unpack here. And I think maybe Christoph, do you want to jump in here and sort of comment on how you sort of see that from your perspective as well, the things that Catherine just described?
No, pleasure. Because Catherine mentioned two important factors. The first was, of course, infrastructure. Assessing the exposure to climate change is much more complex than real estate. Because normally when infrastructure, you're dealing with line objects like highways, pipelines, railways. So it's not only that you have an XY coordinates, so that you have to score a line, or when you have huge solar parks or wind parks, of course you can start to pin each and every windmill, but it's always the question then how you could score certain areas. Therefore, for these two components, we have developed the capabilities to give you a first indication if an area of a couple of square kilometers or smaller or bigger, or lines of a couple of kilometers or hundreds of kilometers, that you have the ability to score them and to find, let's say, the hotspots where you have to go deeper. I guess that's an important. The second one, I guess that's the vulnerability. When we're talking about in real estate, real assets, in real estate, of course, you have already a high variety of vulnerabilities. But when it's coming to infrastructure, it's a huge difference when you're considering, for example, the wind exposure to a wind farm or to a road or to a highway or toll station. So setting up a risk assessment which reflects the exposure of the given project and then scoring it over the time, it's a central question about it. And therefore, I think there is a high, or the industry is quite ambitious to develop a certain framework for infrastructure investments, to have a comparable assessment and to see what are the impact factors on a given asset. Maybe a specific example also on solar panels. So of course the performance of the solar panel changes with the temperature. And there are certain steps where you have to consider in order then, if, for example, in this region, the temperature crossing 40 or 45 degrees, as a sudden the performance of the solar panels is falling down. So if you, first, of course, in the immediate due diligence, now you can consider it, but in the runway to your portfolio, where you have already invested, you have to make now the screening, you have to find the sweet spots or the hotspots you have to look at in order then to define your strategy, your investment strategy, how to invest, how to mitigate, or how to adapt the financial planning or the specific risk itself. So very interesting components Catherine mentioned.
Definitely, thanks. And I think I saw Peter nodding, especially when you mentioned vulnerability. Is that something you you recognize there, Peter?
Yeah, definitely. It's I think to a certain extent we are focusing a lot on how is the future climate going to look, but as important as also being said, right? It's how will that affect a given asset? That's if a given change in the climate is not going to affect an asset, it's not really important. And we don't have to think about that uncertainty of whether wind is going to increase or decrease if it's not important for a given asset. But as Catherine also said, of course, for wind farms, wind speeds are important. For other assets, it's simply not important to consider what the wind speed is going to look like. So that's just the key thing in terms of both things has to be true, right, in order for something to be material here. Yeah,
absolutely.
And that's just an interesting question. That in terms of capex and EBITDA, so to speak, that's the two components to that.
Great. And I think one of the other sort of challenges is, and I think Christoph also touched on it a little bit, of course, infrastructure in and of its own is very different from real estate. And I mean, the assets are a lot larger, can spread a lot sort of larger area, and the effects are also going to be completely different from sector to sector. So you have sort of the different kinds of sectors within infrastructure. You have the sort of size and scope of the assets. And then, if you're a global manager such as BlackRock, I imagine you also have lots of different contexts in which those assets operate, and you have maybe some social impacts relating to climate change as well. How do you sort of keep track of all of that, Catherine? Because I can imagine that being quite overwhelming at times as well.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's interesting what we're talking about in terms of wind farms. So folks think that wind farms need windy conditions. Well, actually, anything over 65 miles per hour, you have to shut down those turbines, because that is real kind of physical damage that can happen to them. So, the wind speed analysis is definitely a key part of what we do. And actually, we underwrite all of our power purchase agreements based on wind conditions, and again over up to a 10-year time horizon. So actually understanding things like that is super critical. There's almost kind of the bottoms up and then the top down approach to how we think about climate risk across all our infrastructure portfolios, and it does start at that investment specific analysis. And sometimes that's easy. It could be a single hospital or a single airport somewhere, and you've got a single zip code or postcode to be doing that analysis. Across midstream pipelines, across toll roads, across railroads, it's often more complex. The longer the asset, the more the geolocation analysis that needs to be done. But I think one of the major differences that we found when we think about the climate risk analysis, specifically the physical climate risk analysis across infrastructure compared to real estate, is almost a dependency on global supply chains that a lot of our infrastructure assets have as well. So it's almost how far does that analysis go? And to give you some examples, we've also invested in shipping fleets, for example. So you're thinking about kind of global impacts of that as a portfolio company and its ability to operate. So the bottom-up approach is important, but the way we aggregate all of this is really at that portfolio level. And we've integrated climate risk analysis into what we call our quarterly portfolio reviews. So formal processes that we go through every quarter to essentially assess portfolio performance, including ESG risk exposure, but that's increasingly looked at physical as well as transition, but physical climate risk exposure across those portfolios, and understanding essentially where those, no pun intended, hotspots might exist across those portfolios, and where that climate risk exposure might be kind of most apparent. Now, as a long-term, as an illiquid investor, exit is not necessarily the most plausible approach, even if we do discover physical climate risk. And actually, we don't want to be in a position where there's forced disposal because of the climate concerns. That goes back to the absolute importance of having this integrated into the investment decision-making process, because if we are not comfortable with physical climate risk, then it generates additional discussion at investment committee. But also we have walked away from deals and we have dismissed deal opportunities because we could not get comfortable with things like inland flooding and sea level rise and the actual kind of geolocation of specific projects. But we track all of that on an ongoing basis. We're constantly running the assets through the models that we have within Aladdin Climate. We're constantly leaning into what is rapidly evolving climate science. And what is so critical about the climate science that we're using now is that it is forward-looking, because historically we've had these backward-looking models that have lent into things like historical events and tried to drive predictions around historical flood events, historical kind of category 4-5 hurricanes. Well, we know that those models are not reliable anymore and that we actually need to look into forward-looking climate science. We know things like the intensity of category 4 and 5 hurricanes is increasing. We've seen that even play out over the last decade. So those forward-looking models at a portfolio level is really, really important. And integrating that all into those portfolio reviews, the constant valuations that we have across those investments, but also, again, going back into kind of the active asset management. We don't necessarily believe that we can be divesting our way out of kind of physical climate concerns, but ultimately, how can we be a proactive asset manager? How can we think about future-proofing and resilience at an individual property level? I think the other thing that we're acutely aware of as well is actually just engagement with the underlying portfolio companies on their own physical climate risk agendas. What we would like to be hoping at a portfolio level has that integrated on the ground. How are they thinking about resilience? Whether it is simple things like elevating certain components of critical infrastructure to prevent it against flood risk or storm surges, actually thinking about kind of curtailment programs with wind turbines against kind of windier and gust conditions and things like that. And obviously, you know, wildfire risk is something that we're increasingly aware of and something that we've actually seen huge advancements in modeling. We do have a number of assets in California. In 2021, the wildfire season alone caused estimated damage of $70 to $90 billion. In the US, of about $15 billion was that in California. So we're acutely aware of wildfire risk and the risk that that does present to those we have in that part of the world. So actually working with kind of local governments as well as the portfolio companies around things like forest management as well is critically important. So it is a never-ending task across portfolio management, but it is a critical and a growing component of what we do as a fiduciary for our clients.
Great. Yeah, very interesting. And it's I think also the sort of reality now of exactly the example you give, the California wildfire season in 2021. I mean, a lot of the forward looking is getting closer and closer to the present day almost, which is alarming, but also means that there's an important role to play for financial industry to sort of be good guardians of real assets and making sure that those risks are factored in. Now, I want to reiterate, please ask any questions we have in the chat function at the event. I'm sure there's a lot of people who want to know maybe a little bit more about what Colonel just said, or maybe something for David as well. So we can have a little more of a discussion on this because I think it's quite interesting. And then if I see any questions come in, I'll put them forward to the group. So maybe one for Christoph as well. I think what Catherine mentioned, you know, like looking at forward looking and trying to sort of quantify that in the appropriate way. How do you see that? Do you see, and maybe a little bit of a devil's advocate question, do you see the scary stranded assets situation happening? Is that something you see managers becoming more and more aware of these days?
I guess that's basically where we are coming from. So, and I would blame it as we have a core competence in assessing the actual risk. And of course, actual risk is, let's say, it's coming from the past, but basically we always trended near term to the future. And that is the strong current assessment of risk. And I guess that's, I wouldn't say the most important, but it's very important to have a clear understanding what is the risk as of today. And that doesn't mean it's only coming from the past. And then, of course, looking into the future, as Catherine said, of course, there is an increase of wind speed in given regions. You will have an increase of flooding areas, which at the moment you might not have tagged on. And to understand, let's say, the combination between the investment, so where the investment will be in the future and where the risks in the future will be, I guess that's, you can call it an opportunity, because it's a winning opportunity looking forward to understand where you can invest without having this type of exposure. Whereas when you're looking at as of today, of course, you have already stranded asset, because in certain regions, it's already impossible to get insurance for the given coverage. And that means it's affecting the investors directly on the capex side. So you are running the risk at your own, and that means you have to consider the risk versus the return you're getting on the given asset in order to further develop the strategy, or to further invest in mitigation measurements in order to make it more resilient. And when we are talking about resilience, it's not only on the asset itself, it's also on the surroundings. So that means it's nice that you have a completely protected wind park, but if the electrical infrastructure, the TD lines, are heavily exposed, and you cannot connect your wind park to the grid, so you might have a similar situation on your revenue, or in function of the adaptation or mitigation measurements you have in place in order to tackle this. So summarizing, from our perspective, it's really important to understand the current and then have robust projections into the future. And we know that over the given climate scenarios, that will change. So constant review of the given data of your portfolio will be important to see new trends or the confirmation of the trend you have identified and where you have developed the corresponding strategy. And I guess it's there where Peter's service is also coming into place, really to help the customers to understand it and to develop a plan in order to act, and not to react when it's too late.
Yeah, Peter, do you want to comment a little bit on that? Maybe that's such a nice segue. I feel like we should hand over to you again.
No, I definitely agree that this is going to be an important thing going forward, and something that will need the constant reassessing, because we're just looking into a science that's developing. So you know, that's good for us, of course, but also important for society. So yeah, I think that's true.
Great. I don't see any questions coming in on our chat function just yet. So maybe I'll round off with a bit of a final few questions, and sort of maybe asking also for maybe some takeaways from the panel. So, you know, we're seeing so many different kinds of risk, and I think it's really interesting to hear from you all how to approach that at the sort of asset versus portfolio level. Now, my final question would be to sort of ask you, how do you best communicate that then? So you know, you're the subject matter experts in your organizations or towards your clients. How do you sort of tackle communicating that to someone who's maybe not a climate change expert, who maybe understands a bit of risk or financial risk management, but is able to look into the sort of science behind it all and connecting all of those dots? So I think I saw Catherine nodding quite vigorously. So do you want to maybe start there, Catherine?
Yeah, it's a great question. We touched on it very briefly earlier in terms of communicating to the investment teams. And it's almost been positioned of, well, climate risk is how we should be thinking about just investment risk. So the same way we would consider liquidity risk or credit risk is how we're thinking about climate risk. So it has to be that core component. And I think that's something that we've done under internal teach-ins, and it's something that the sophistication of our own investors within BlackRock is really increasing in terms of this is how we should be using this data, this is how we should be interpreting data, and actually using it to help inform those investment decisions. So it's been truly integrated into the investment decision process, but that has taken obviously time in terms of how you use the data. And by the way, we do have, I can't do modeling, but we do have guys on our team who will take the outputs of Aladdin Climate, which generally generates something like 3,000 rows of data per single investment that we run through, to actually make that usable and useful to the investment teams in terms of these are the key, and going back to material, these are the key material considerations that we need to be having in the context of this specific investment. How do we think about that in the underwriting? Does this essentially cause us to reprice or revalue the entire investment opportunity? I think insurance is something we haven't really touched on, but again, those kind of in conversations around insurability of investments and actually the impact that can have on returns as well is critical, because I do think there's still a bit of a disconnect between insurance premiums and physical climate risk. It's not fully been priced in, and remains to be seen whether there'll be a revolution or evolution in all of that. So that internal piece has been really key in terms of getting the process embedded, but understanding not just the what and the why, but the how, and how all of that kind of data can be used in a meaningful way. I think when I think about key stakeholders and communication, a lot of that is actually our clients. So our clients, they're coming into these long-term strategies. They want to understand how we are protecting and if not enhancing their returns over the long run. So they're very key to understand what we are doing on climate. I'd say our clients here in Europe especially are very, very focused on this. Although increasingly so in APAC as well, and the US, as you could imagine, it's a little bit dependent on kind of regional differences and changes in the US. But I think there's two components that our clients want to understand is the process. How are we actually thinking about climate risk? How is that practically integrated into the investment decision making? How are we then feeding that through into that active asset management? What does resilience and future proofing actually look like? That obviously varies significantly. It's bespoke for each investment. The geographical changes are sector specific and asset specific changes, but they want comfort that we are actually integrating this into everything. And then I think the other component is just that high level, what does that risk exposure look like across a portfolio at any given time? And all of that is just underpinned by real appetite from our clients to be understanding all of this. They want to understand physical climate risk. They want to understand how a changing physical climate will be interacting with our portfolios. And so that's really kind of opening the door for very, very open conversations with our clients on what we're doing now, how we expect that to evolve, because the climate science is getting better. I think what's really interesting is a lot of the climate science has been built around things like 1.5 scenarios. The likelihood is we're not going to meet that trajectory, and we are going to have to be thinking about what underwriting and valuing looks like in a warming climate beyond 1.5, maybe even 2 degrees, which is incredibly stark. But I think that's the reality, is we can expect the climate change to continue to change. But what we're also seeing, and you mentioned it as well, Katie, is a lot of that kind of forward-looking forecast seems to be happening now. So whether it's extreme flooding in places like Pakistan and Europe, actually some of the climate models weren't predicting those kind of events for another decade. So I think we're going to have to continue to evolve that climate science. It's going to get smarter and hopefully more accurate in that forecasting. But we are always going to have those anomaly events that come along, the unprecedented events that even the most sophisticated climate models couldn't actually predict. So how do we think about all of that again as long-term investors, and how do we make sure that we've got the most accurate tools to be integrating it? So it's a long dialogue. It's a really thoughtful dialogue that we're having with our clients, but ultimately they just want the confidence and the comfort that we're thinking about this really with their best interests at heart as part of our portfolio management.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, that's I think really really insightful, and it sounds like there's still a lot to be done for the industry as a whole to make sure things are on track, and we can provide the kind of resilience infrastructure that the world needs. Maybe a few very short statements from Christoph and Peter in response to that, and then we can wrap it up. So maybe Christoph, Catherine commented a little bit on the premium of a climate risk and how that's priced in, and maybe that can be improved a little. So I realize that can be quite a big thing to talk about, but I'll ask you to keep it very short anyway, because we're otherwise going to be running out of time. Yeah, what do you think?
I think the question of insurability or affordability is a quite important topic. That's without a doubt. I mean, it's and we see this in the real estate area. So there's a clear impact on the banking side. And we see it also, of course, on the infrastructure investment side, when you're looking that you have to grant in a certain way over multi-years coverage. Because if not, the mitigation or the risk insurance might disappear in your calculations. And I guess what is without a doubt there important is that there is a risk improvement. So on the individual asset side, but also from the government side. So the protection measurements where the government is investing in is decisive to ensure that an insurance ecosystem might further exist or might be further developed. Therefore, we strongly believe that a public-private partnership is quite important to ensure the resiliency and the insurability of given regions. And so therefore, we are investing there quite a lot, and not only on developed countries, but also on the further developing countries in order to improve this, and having also certain initiatives in place, which were communicated also over during COP27. So from our perspective, that's also for our industry the most important topic. And I'm always coming back to, we've announced, I guess, the first climate warming alerts in 1973. So it's not new that we see that the risk is changing and that you have a clear trend that it's aggravating, and you have to invest in a more resilient world.
Thanks, Christoph. And yeah, it's hopefully we can finally make some changes for the future with that. Peter, final words.
No, it's just been great. I think that we're now discussing this also at this level. You know, it's really important that we as a society adapt, and that includes also the individual assets, of course. But I fully agree with Christoph also that the society as a whole needs to do something, so to speak. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. That's I think a nice takeaway. Let's all think a bit more about climate risk and resilience in the future. I'm sure that we at GRESB are doing that, and we're making some changes, as David mentioned. We have the foundations and standard changes events next week, so you can ask any questions relating to that. Now, thank you so much to our panel for joining today. I thought that was an incredibly interesting discussion, and I hope it was interesting to the attendees as well. I'll now hand over to Anders to close the event. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot for joining here today. What I took away was also the specificity of this discussion, and this alliance between data, knowledge, and investing was really interesting. Really interesting to hear from Catherine how specific this is, how deeply integrated it is into the investment and asset management phase on the phases. From Christoph, it was many interesting things, and also great to hear that you're doing this area function now, where you can go beyond geo-specific locations, but also look at areas. I think that would be a great help to many. Peter's point on understanding the materiality, I think, was really important. So you don't need to understand everything, but what's material to your assets. And then it was great to hear David's points that you still show significant progress in the EMEA data for infrastructure. That was great. So thanks a lot to the audience. Thanks a lot to the speakers, and have a great day.
Thank you.